This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you are tuned to When Science Speaks. Thanks for being here. This episode of the show is sponsored by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists get funding, gain influence, and build strategic relationships with the stakeholders who matter most in their professional lives. And that journey often involves effective translation of complicated research into engaging, jargon-free communication that boils down complex topics to capture the attention of general audiences. If you're interested in getting a free resource to help you do just that, simply go to complexitymadeclear.com to get the 11 keys for translating complexity. That's complexitymadeclear.com to get your free infographic used by science communicators at major organizations to boil down, not dumb down, complicated science and technical topics for general audiences. It is such a great pleasure to have Dr. Wändi Bruine de Bruin on the show today. Wändi is Provost Professor of Public Policy, Psychology, and Behavioral Science at University of Southern California, where she is affiliated with the Saul Price School of Public Policy and the Dornsife College of Letters, Arts, and Sciences. She leads USC's Behavioral Science and Wellbeing Policy Initiative. Her research uses insights from behavioral science and psychology to understand and inform how individuals make decisions about a wide variety of topics, including climate change and its impacts, sustainability, personal health, and household finance. Wändi has served on several expert panels on risk in science communication, including the National Academy of Sciences and the Council of the Canadian Academies. She earned her Ph.D. in behavioral decision-making and psychology from Carnegie Mellon University. Welcome to the show, Wändi. It is wonderful to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
You know, as I mentioned in the introduction, you're the lead author of the recent study from USC and the United Nations Foundation aimed at improving the public's understanding of climate change. And I would love for you to share with our listeners more about the study, its goals, and all sort of the surrounding motivations around that.
Yes, so this study was a collaboration with the United Nations Foundation, and as you may or may not know, they support the IPCC in communicating about climate change to policymakers, practitioners, and general public around the world. And IPCC reports have been sharing information about climate science for decades, but they can be quite difficult to read. They are written in scientific language. And so what we did is we asked the United Nations Foundation and IPCC authors to identify key terminology from their reports and then tested whether members from the general public in the United States understood what those terms meant. And those terms were mitigation, adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, carbon neutral, and so on. You may have heard some of those. And what we found is that those terms are easy to misinterpret. Even if people may have heard some of the terms, they do not necessarily know what they mean in a climate context. And so our advice to the IPCC and anyone who communicates about climate change is to keep the wording simple, or if you must use complex terms, explain what they mean in the context of climate change.
So important. And you've mentioned that as experts in a particular field, scientists, and not just climate scientists, but scientists may not realize which of the words they're using are actually jargon. And every profession has its specialized terminology, whether it's law or medicine or science. how do you think scientists can become more attuned to how the general public perceives its use of scientific language?
The thing that you could do is to try to write or speak in a way that avoids words that are 3 syllables or more as a rule of thumb, because words that are 3 syllables or more tend to be less commonly used in everyday language and tend to be less widely recognized by people who don't have your background, and there's generally tend to be more likely to be jargon.
I love that. It is so true. Getting access if possible, or finding ways to connect with people who are either going to be in your audience or listeners with similar kind of levels of understanding. I wonder, from your perspective, whether you think that perhaps cultural norms of science and scientific inquiry historically have discouraged actually plain language communication.
Well, I think in any field, whether it's climate science, psychology, public health, what happens is as people get educated in their field of expertise, they are taught to use specific terminology to describe important concepts within their field. And when communicating with our colleagues, it's very important to use those terms to be clear about, to be clear and specific about what we're trying to study and communicate to each other. But those terms are not necessarily the right terms to use when speaking to people who are not in our field. And I think that's easy to forget, because if you've been trained in a field for 10, 20, 30 years, you're used to using specific terminology that has very specific meanings to you and to your colleagues. And you may not realize that other people don't use those words in the same way. They may not use those words at all, or if they use them, they may use them in a different way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thinking about more recent times now, do you feel that these norms of, communication with, say, non-experts, and as you pointed out, it is critical to use sort of the native language when you're inside your circle of colleagues, but thinking about being outside that circle, whether you feel that these norms are beginning to shift towards perhaps rewarding science communication in publications that are accessible and interesting to general audiences. So as a way for scientists to sort of practice, communicating, whether that's writing or orally, with non-experts now. Thinking about recent times, do you feel that the practice of communicating more with general audiences, that could be writing in journals or, and I don't mean journals for professional consumption, sort of more general interest publications, I should say. Do you feel that writing in those sorts of publications or communicating more now with general audiences is becoming, something that's more encouraged or perhaps even incentivized or rewarded within academia?
Yeah, I think I'm seeing a shift. So I think it used to be in many fields that what was important that you published was that you published in academic journals that communicated your findings to your colleagues. And I think it's becoming more encouraged now in many fields that we share our findings to practitioners, policymakers, members of the general public, so that people can actually do something with those findings where appropriate. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that it would be nice if science communication was a part of the curriculum in undergrad, grad school, and perhaps thereafter, so that we learn to communicate about our findings in a way that is useful to people who are not in our field.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm happy to say that my alma mater, Cornell University, now has a minor in science communication. So as for undergrad, so that they can add that focus as their field of study in their undergraduate years. I think about, we're talking in November of 2021. the COVID pandemic is still with us. As I look at it, just from a communication standpoint, it seems to me that the pandemic is really an historic use case for the need for stronger science communication. And I wonder if you could comment on that and share your own perspective.
Well, I think the pandemic has shown how important it is to have good science communication and what happens if you don't do it well. I think a pandemic is also a more challenging example because it's been well known for those of us who have studied pandemics that during a pandemic, the information you want to share is changing all the time because you're talking about a new virus and you're learning about the virus and how it spreads and how you can stop the spread as you go. So that means that some of your communications become outdated quite quickly. And so you have to deal with that uncertainty and that change in information, which can make it very difficult to communicate well.
Yeah, I think that is such an important point. It's almost like the pandemic is presented like an incredibly difficult science communication challenge.
Right.
For those reasons, communicating about uncertainty, for example, can be really hard. As we wrap up and you think about the communications around COVID, as I kind of look at it, these communications from scientists and medical professionals, other experts, weren't happening in a vacuum. I mean, there were strong headwinds of misinformation and disinformation that were unleashed from pretty huge megaphones, from the highest levels of the US government and other governments around the world. So it was really a difficult endeavor. First of all, as you point out, things were changing. This is a new virus, learning new things. Things that were said could become outdated or contradicted by new scientific findings. And at the same time that's happening, you have this countervailing force that's saying the opposite, not based on any kind of science, but really based on ideology and other types of things. And so, it can be difficult enough to translate complicated scientific terms into accessible descriptions, and then you've got all this other stuff flying around and other messaging going around that is distorting and completely obliterating truth and scientific information, I should say. So I wonder if you could just discuss a little bit with me how you think scientists could go about countering misinformation regarding scientific findings, such as the impacts of climate change or any other sort of topics that you would like to address.
Well, that is a really important question, and I'm not sure that I have a good answer to it, but I have some ideas. I mean, if we can think about the long run, I think what might be helpful is if science could be a part of the curriculum in schools from early on, so that people have a better understanding of the climate and of health issues that are important to their lives, so that when they receive misinformation, they can recognize that it is misinformation based on training they have already had. But of course, I can't control what's being taught in school. And other scientists may have difficulties with that as well. So we may need to think of other strategies that may include working towards having good connections with community groups and organizations that people trust. So that when there is a crisis, people turn to the scientific information to find out what's going on and what to do, and not to sources that do not necessarily have the scientific information available and are trying to spread misinformation.
Yeah, I think that is such an insightful point that you're making, Wändi. And you mentioned trust, which is so important. And as I, look at this, a comfort with emotion. You focus a lot in your work on how humans make decisions, and as you know, it's not just about facts and graphs and data and quantitative information, which seems to be often the domain where scientists are most comfortable. Particularly when it comes to things like misinformation, and people are going to areas or outlets that they trust. Sometimes building that trust requires more than just providing the latest study or delivering the latest journal article. It has to include also, not that those are fundamental, but and also things that touch upon more factors that could be considered credibility issues or trust issues or emotional issues. And it can be hard to build up those things, particularly in real time when there's so much going on and needs to be responded to.
Yeah, something that may be difficult for scientists to keep in mind is that not everybody has the time, the ability, the resources, or the motivation to sit down and read every piece of scientific information that is available about a crisis that is at hand. And so to save time and effort, a shortcut maybe is just to look at someone you trust to explain what's going on. And I think if we even the very highly trained scientists probably can admit that if they are thinking about a topic that they're not an expert on, they may not always turn to the scientific journals, but instead to people they trust to get the information about what's going on. Having the science out there is important, but that may not be the only thing that is needed to change people's minds or change people's behavior. People are not necessarily going to have the time, the effort, or the motivation or the ability to read the scientific information that is out there. And so they may instead turn to someone they trust to ask them to explain what's going on.
So true. And those will be the last words of the episode. Thank you for presenting it so clearly and so impactfully, Dr. Wändi Bruine de Bruin. This has been a wonderful conversation. Your work is so important. Your study with UN Foundation on climate change is really adding to that conversation in many meaningful ways. Thank you for doing what you do.
Thank you for having me.
And listeners, thank you for being along on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you will be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to click subscribe. Check us out on the web at whensciencespeaks.com, and we'll see you next time.